Hello, I'm Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In the This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network, in 1939, on the 3rd of December, Finland appeals to the League of Nations about the Soviet invasion. On the 5th of December, the Red Army reaches the Mannerheim line deep inside Finland. In 1940, on the 5th of December, the Hundred Regiments Offensive ends in Chinese victory, and the Greek army enters Albania. On the 6th of December, Pietro Badoglio resigns as Chief of Staff of the Italian army, and the Italian ambassador to Berlin asks for German help in Greece. On the 7th of December, Hitler agrees to send 50 troop transport planes to move units from Italy to Albania. In 1941, on the 1st of December, Japan rejects US proposals to settle its dispute with Washington as fantastic and unrealistic. Gerd von Rundstedt resigns following the German retreat from Rostov. On the 2nd of December, Japanese Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki is authorised to attack any time after midnight on the 7th of December. Cryptologists intercept Japanese orders to destroy codes at the Japanese embassy in Washington. On the 4th of December, the Japanese invasion fleets depart for Malaya and Thailand. On the 5th of December, Britain declares war on Finland, Hungary and Romania. The Red Army launches a counter-offensive in the Battle of Moscow, and on the 6th of December, Roosevelt writes a personal appeal to Emperor Hirohito to avoid war. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan launches the invasion of British Malaya. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor begins at 7:55 a.m. Japan declares war on the US, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa. Hitler issues the Nacht- und Nebel decree targeting dissidents for disappearance, and Rommel pulls his forces back to the Gazala line. Japan bombs Midway. In 1942, on the 1st of December, German forces in Tunisia counterattack at Tabourba, and the Beveridge Report is published in the UK. On the 2nd of December, scientists led by Enrico Fermi achieved the first self-sustained nuclear chain reaction at Chicago, Pile 1. Benito Mussolini tells the Chamber of Fasces and Corporations that Italian cities should be evacuated. On the 3rd of December, Hitler places Axis forces in Tunisia under Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. On the 4th of December, Carlson's patrol in Guadalcanal ends in Allied victory. American B-24s bomb Italy for the first time, and on the 5th of December, Roosevelt suspends the induction of all men over the age of 38 into the armed forces. In 1943, on the 1st of December, the Tehran Conference ends. On the 2nd of December, at least 83 people are killed by gas from chemical weapons on an Allied ship in Bari. 1 out of 10 men called up, aged 18 to 25, are ordered to work in British coal mines. On the 4th of December, the Second Cairo Conference opens with UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, US President Roosevelt, and Turkish President Inonu. Tito proclaims a provisional Yugoslav government in exile. The Moro River Campaign begins in Italy. On the 5th of December, the Allies begin Operation Crossbow to stop the V-1 rocket program. And on the 7th of December, Roosevelt tells Dwight Eisenhower in Tunis that he's to command Operation Overlord. In 1944, on the 3rd of December, British troops and Greek police fired on a leftist demonstration in Athens. On the 6th of December, the Japanese paratroopers land at Leyte. And on the 7th of December, US forces in Leyte halt the Japanese offensive. In In 1945, on the 1st of December, the military police arrest 76 Nazi industrialists. On the 4th of December, the US Senate approves the UN Participation Act. On the 6th of December, General MacArthur orders the arrest of former Japanese Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe and 8 others as war criminals. On the 7th of December, Tomiyuki Yamashita is found guilty of war crimes in Manila and sentenced to death, and the US State Department announces plans to resettle 6.6 million Germans from Eastern Europe. Well, there you are. We've gone through the years of the Second World War, and we're looking at the first week of December. Obviously, the one that shouts out, the date that shouts out to you is the 7th of December, 1941. Arguably the most significant moment in world history, at least modern world history, and changed the direction of human civilization, and still is having ramifications. Now, before we discuss that, let me bring onto the stage my partner here, Dr. Joe Quinn. How you doing, Joe?
I'm good this evening. How are you, Eddie?
Yes. What do you think? We're going to talk about it later, but thinking about it, 7th of December 1941, the Pearl Harbor attack. Is there another date in modern world history that you think would rival that? Maybe 1917 with the Russian Revolution? But for a single day, this really was a huge moment, wasn't it, Joe?
Yeah, well, the ramifications of this event are still being felt today. I mean, we are in an era where the United States government are actively contemplating a withdrawal of U.S. Military muscle, and a closing down, or possibly partial, possibly large-scale closing down of U.S. military infrastructure globally. And what we don't realize is basically we're talking about a sort of an American version of the Roman Empire, Pax Americana, as Kennedy alluded to in the 1960s. This is basically, it's almost like an imperial presence on a global stage without actually having a formal military control over every single district, systems of taxation and whatever like that, what you saw in the Roman Empire. But you do have boots on the ground and a strategic presence all over the globe, both in terms of naval forces, armed forces, military, Marines, as well as the Air Force as well. The US Air Force's presence is global, and they have this ability to reach any point in the world in order to protect their own interests and also destabilizing events in various different regions of the world. And this is unparalleled in modern history, even with the British Empire. The British Empire had a similar structure, but it wasn't near, the reach was not nearly as, shall we say, intense as American reaches. The Americans are able to hit any part of the world with more firepower than was ever used in human history. And they have that capacity today. And the reason they have that capacity and they have this global presence, this global infrastructure, in order to be able to project this military might, is because of the events of December 7th, 1941. This was the date which shifted America away from an isolationist stance to becoming, entering the world stage finally as a global world power. They had arguably done this during the First World War and its aftermath, but they had retreated back into isolation and had retreated from global commitments. They did not want to, shall we say, honor the great and hefty commitment that they had made towards establishing a world order and global peace in the aftermath of the First World War, and indeed even the way in which they concluded their shall we say, involvement in the First World War. They had insisted that they were not an allied power, but an associate power, which gave them the right to conclude a separate peace with the Kaiser's Germany, or rather with the Germany that was left after the Kaiser abdicated. What happens after December 7th, 1941, is that the United States enters the Second World War on the Allied side as an Allied power and binds itself to basically a premise of unconditional surrender in lockstep with its fellow powers, the Britain, the Commonwealth and Empire, and with the Soviet Union, and with France when it's liberated, and with China, as well as the other allied powers. And it commits itself to a joint strategy and to essentially being firmly locked into this global allied, shall we say, coalition against the Axis forces. And what ensues throughout the course of the Second World War and thereafter is essentially an American-governed world order, which we are still living with today. It might be crumbling as we speak, particularly with the instability in the United States. But the fact of the matter is, this was put into play on that particular date, December 7, 1941. It opens the basically the book on this particular era that we find ourselves still living in, possibly at the end of. But the American hegemony, American dominance in global affairs, it all stems back to that date, making it, as you rightly say, Eddie, possibly the most consequential date in modern human history.
Yes, I mean, we can have a little test on this. Anybody come up with a more significant date for world history, change the nature? And of course, I talk to my Italian friends and specialize in the Italian campaign, and I point out to my Italian friends that the Mussolini declared war against the United States on the 11th of December. So didn't have to. Germany did it as well at the same time. So with Italy declaring war on the United States, it put Italy on the front line against American armed forces, and we know what happened then. So really, I don't think you can really overstate it. And I think to a certain extent, although people see the films, like Pearl Harbor and Tora Tora, and they think, oh my goodness, it's an American drama, but it's a global drama, and it really changes the face of the world. We'll come into the detail of that in a minute, but let's go through some of the dates, and I've got a few slides that I'm going to put up. First one, we've dealt with this before, so I don't want to go into great detail. So in this week, in 1939, so as far as the British and French were concerned, this is a period of almost of the phony war. Some people were thinking maybe the war wouldn't go any further than it did. Not an awful lot of war enthusiasm, but there was a very hot front here in Finland, with the Red Army invading Finland. You can see the Mannerheim line in black, and that's where they reached. The Red Army reached, and of course this was followed by quite a considerable setback for the Soviet army. But that's what was happening this week, and Finland appealed to the League of Nations. Good luck, asking them to do something to intervene. Of course, that came to absolutely nothing. But let's move on to the next moment. And now this is December 1940. So, and this is about General Badoglio. He's a guy on the left, and he's one of these characters who's kind of falls out of history. But I have to say, there's very little merit in him. Born in 1871, he was a senior commander in the Italian army at the Battle of Caporetto in the First World War. And some Italians said that his dispositions of his forces, and at that point he was in his mid-40s, were wrong. And that's one of the reasons why it was such a disaster for the Italian army, Caporetto. But despite that, he was made chief of the General Staff in 1925, position he held for 15 years, made marshal, so he was Marshal Badoglio. And he was involved, the first sole governor of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, which is basically Libya. And he was working with Rodolfo Graziani, depicted by Oliver Reed in the film The Lion of the Desert. And he was very much involved in the attempt. I mean, he suppressed the Libyan rising of the Senussi tribe, and he was calling for the most savage of reprisals. And then, of course, he marched into Addis Ababa in May 1936 in front of the conquering Italian army, a reason why Italy was kicked out of the League of Nations. So there's a lot of things that are wrong about him. And then he was blamed for the failure of the Italian army to make any progress against the Greeks in the autumn and winter of 1914, was replaced by the guy on the right, Ugo Cavallero, who took over as chief of staff. Now, it's said that Badoglio was furious about this. He didn't like being scapegoated, and he was waiting in the wings. And so at the time of the Italian armistice in September 1943, so you're moving on now another 3 years, Pietro Badoglio was selected by the King, Victor Emmanuel, to become prime minister and replace Mussolini. So he was prime minister until from that period until June 1944. He could have been held responsible for a whole host of things. A questionable person. Anything to say about Pietro? Anything good to say about Pietro Badoglio?
Not particularly, no. I mean, Badoglio, I know he had some good credentials. I mean, in terms of his military career, been involved in the Battle of Caporetto is hardly a feather in his cap. Caporetto was and is still remembered as one of the greatest defeats that the Italian army ever suffered. I mean, it was a horrendous defeat. It was basically the advent of, the Germans had really involved themselves very deeply in the Italian campaign, and they'd knocked them for 6. And the episode of Caporetto and afterwards, it leads to this catastrophic Italian retreat. The Italian positions, which they'd fought over for 2.5 years, essentially virtually collapse in this particular part of the north of Italy, and you have this horrific retreat, and the Italian rearguard have to step in, and they have to actually start, it's very tragic, they start orchestrating mass executions in order to stop the troops from retreating, and they pull out a lot of officers and execute them on the spot. So it's pretty unpleasant. And so being present at that particular moment, it would leave quite an impression in one's mind if you were an officer surviving Caporetto and its aftermath. It's not a good... I know the Italians are well accustomed to military defeats, but this was a military defeat of a very horrific scale. It was something that caused a great deal of embarrassment and national shame, and the Allies really had to step in and bolster the Italians big time on their front from that point onwards. I would have to say that Badoglio is not a figure that I know a huge amount about. I do know that his relationship with a lot of commanders in particular regions like Graziani in Libya, basically, who's primed to lead the Italian offensive in the Western Desert against the British, who are vastly outnumbered by the Italians, but who have some level of technical superiority. They have a certain amount of backup in terms of air cover. The Desert Air Force is very nascent, but it is effective enough to hold the line. And also the British are seemingly much better at tank warfare than the Italians are. And Graziani is his clash of with Badoglio it's a lot of it is connected in 1940 with the fact that he's been urged by Mussolini and by Badoglio to make his advance, to make a decisive advance into Egypt and actually essentially make a decisive incursion into British protectorate territory, and to, sort of inaugurate this campaign against the British. And Graziani can't, not out of cowardice, but because of the fact that his supply lines are stretched too thin, and he is genuinely concerned that if he commits too many of his troops, of his forces, into this campaign, that he might end up being outflanked and encircled and cut off. And he's very aware of what the facts are on the ground in terms of the Italian army's ability to move. There's a certain lack of confidence. And Badoglio's great claim to fame, of course, is the fact that he was the general who presided. He was the Italian commander who presided over the defeat of the Ethiopians and marched into Addis Ababa. And it was a very sort of a glorious, sort of very, shall we say, triumphant moment for the Italian state, and was a sort of a vindication of Mussolini's, shall we say, right to rule. The fact of the matter is that the victory in Abyssinia, or what's now Ethiopia, came at basically the price that was paid was essentially the what I would say the honor of Italian arms, in the fact that they essentially perpetrated a form of genocide against the people that they were attacking. They were attacking people that were very poorly armed and very poorly trained, and in most cases didn't even have modern European firearms, and they attacked them with by air. They used biochemical weapons against them, and they perpetrated shocking atrocities in their rear and in their front as they advanced into that country. So it was an act of barbarism, really, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia and their conquest of that country. So not much really that he can kind of use to commend himself, apart from the fact that he was possibly a more unifying figure within the Italian armed forces, probably divisive in many ways, but a more unifying figure in that there was a lot of senior Italian officers would have regarded him with a certain degree of respect. And he was a pure military man and not a political appointee, unlike his successor.
This whole in this whole period, the key figure, of course, was Victor Emmanuel, the king. The king appointed Badoglio prime minister. The king assented to it. Badoglio is one of these characters lost in history. Italian imperialism. Haven't heard of that, but he was very live and active, and he was one of the great champions of it. So anyway, I thought he'd be worth discussing for a bit. We'll come back to him on another occasion. And now we're moving on to another person who was sacked. This time it's December 41. So we're moving on a year to December 41. And so it's von Rundstedt. That picture is not von Rundstedt. It's played by Leo Carroll, actually an English actor of Irish descent, who played von Rundstedt in the Desert Fox film with James Mason on the right, playing Rommel. So the film is essentially about Rommel, but they have Rundstedt, and famously in a telephone call after the Allied landings in D-Day, von Rundstedt is calling up German headquarters, army headquarters, and say, surrender, you fool. But his background is very substantial. May 1949, he was commander of Army Group South. In Army Group South, was several armies in the invasion of Poland and then France. He was appointed commander-in-chief of the West in 1940, following the conquest of France. And then he was deployed, and he was Army Group South in Operation Barbarossa. No evidence he ever opposed it, but he was a very effective commander and was commanding the Army Group South in the encirclement in Kiev, which is considered the greatest victory of the German army in the Second World War. But then he was replaced. He was sacked by Hitler for withdrawing, refusing to hold the ground in Rostov, and he pulled back, and Hitler dismissed him, but then regretted him that he did it and brought him back as commander-in-chief for the West, for the Western area, and where he was right up until D-Day and afterwards. And this image here is basically von Rundstedt talking to Rommel about the consequences of Operation Overlord. He was replaced by Kluge in June 1944, so Hitler got rid of him again. But he was then reappointed in September 1944, and he continued to hold the position of the commander-in-chief in the West until September 1944, when he was so old and sick, he said, I can't do it any longer. So von Rundstedt, any comments about him?
My cousin Robin actually went to school with his granddaughter, actually, as it happens, Cecilia von Rundstedt. And I do know that within the family, there's a certain degree of pride about the fact that, he's like a lot of these, shall we say, very Prussian type Wehrmacht commanders. He's descended or distilled of something that is somewhat separate from, shall we say, the zeitgeist of Nazism. Forgive the use of that expression, but effectively, something that is apart from, shall we say, the spectre of National Socialism. So he's viewed as very much independent of that whole dark period in German history, representing, like Rommel, like various different other army commanders, representing something alternative to, shall we say, Nazi barbarism. Shall we say, the honorable knights that are forced by their corrupt and evil king to basically charge in and perform their duties and lead their men in very dire circumstances in some of the worst campaigns of the Second World War. There's a certain amount of merit to that argument, and certainly this whole argument had been kind of in some ways peddled by movies such as, the movie Rommel with James Mason, and a lot of books that were written after the war by authors like Corelli Barnett and various different authors who were almost apologists for this generation of German generals that were seen as noble men from noble stock, with noble cause and noble purpose, doing their jobs to the best of their ability, but ultimately failing in the face of impossible odds, and for the better, of course, because the masters that they served were unworthy of the great genius and the great, shall we say, the great aplomb that these men brought to the fore. Rundstedt kind of represents a darker story in some respects, though. Rundstedt, was in cahoots with quite a lot of generals. He may not have been a Nazi supporter himself, and he may have looked down on Hitler in many respects. We're talking about a general who, blatantly said to Hitler, or blatantly said to Hitler's generals when he was asked to come up with some solution. He said, "Yes, I have a solution. End the war, you damn fools." And somebody who was not afraid to speak his mind to Hitler, even at the cost of his own life. I think this is probably something that the Nazi elite and indeed Hitler himself possibly respected about him, and they possibly feared the fact that Rundstedt was one of these galvanizing figures within the Wehrmacht. He was sort of untouchable, if you will. You could appoint him, you could sack him, you could reappoint him whenever an emergency emerged, and he was a reliable general, a steady hand, a respected man within the military, loved by his men. And Gerd von Rundstedt did have considerable battlefield talent, and he was a man who could galvanize forces. And it was not for nothing that Rundstedt was appointed commander of the Western theater in Europe, and the Western Front, basically, of German forces facing the Allies in the West, that he did steady the front, that he did reorganize the German forces, and he did prepare the way for a counterattack, which was the Ardennes offensive. But more importantly, his appointment came just not even a week, but days before the launch of Operation Market Garden. And it was as a result of repositioning of forces within the Netherlands that actually resulted in the British coming afoul. It was a result of him. He was the one who made the decision to locate two SS Panzer Corps in Arnhem, which unfortunately British First Airborne dropped on top of. And this was arguably Rundstedt's first victory after his reappointment in 1944 as the commander in the West. I would have to say, though, that he is tainted by a great level of moral cowardice, because there was evidence that was circulated, I believe, in the 1980s, that when Rundstedt was commander in the Soviet Union, and also when he was involved in the campaign in Poland, and in addition when he was also commander in the West, that he was aware of the darker side of the Nazi conquest and essentially the German involvement in the war, in that they were perpetrating atrocities against civilians in their rear. They were perpetrating atrocities against Jewish populations and against Soviet citizens. And, the commando order, which was issued by, OKW, it was something that was basically authorized by Hitler. This was something that was carried out by German forces in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, and also the order to basically execute political officers. Do people think that Rundstedt wasn't complicit in these crimes or wasn't knowledgeable of them? Of course he was. Like many German commanders, he had blood on his hands, and he doesn't get to walk away from the darker side of what the German military did during the Second World War, nor should he be allowed to.
Yeah, and he was held until 1949 in prison, so 4 years. He was released, died in 1953. So anyway, thought it was worth spending time. Now we're going to come on to the Pearl Harbor. I'm not going to go into too much because I wanted to put this map up because it shows where the Japanese were landing on the 7th to 8th of December 1941.
So they were landing in the White Area, which is British Malaya. So this was a colonial territory defended by British Commonwealth Imperial Forces. And you can see the route that they took, eventually leading to the capture of Singapore in February 1942. But the other part, which I'm referring to here, is the role of Thailand. So the Japanese landed in Thailand, which was an independent kingdom, and on the 21st of December, Thailand basically became an ally of Japan. Didn't really have much choice. The Japanese army was there. Nevertheless, they did form an alliance, and Thailand was used as a base for Japanese operations against Burma later in the war. So let's go on to Pearl Harbor itself. The map shows the huge scale of the Japanese operations, stunning extent of the operations, all the way over to Hawaii, down to New Guinea, Indochina. They're already occupying a substantial portion of mainland China and Korea. So it's an enormously ambitious process. And just have this is a map of the attack. The red arrows you can see the red ships, which are the aircraft carriers, and you can see the way that the Japanese bombers flew over Honolulu and to attack Pearl Harbor. And you can see the smaller map on the right shows you where the American ships were lined up, sitting targets. Happily for the Americans, no aircraft carriers. And just move on to another slide. This is the butcher's bill. So 2,000 sailors killed, 218 soldiers and airmen killed, 100 Marines killed, 68 civilians killed, 18 ships sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. But a quick word on Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, who was commander of the Pacific Fleet. And famously, he's depicted in one of the films as ripping off his shoulder boards, and he's replaced by Chester Nimitz. So in many respects, in terms of American strategy, removal of Kimmel and replacement with Chester Nimitz was a very positive development for the longer term. Kimmel, do you think do you agree with the historians? Do the historians now say Kimmel was basically, they wanted a scapegoat and he served that purpose?
Well, Kimmel's predecessor warned him that an attack was very likely. He said that the fleet should have stayed in San Diego where it belonged. There were a lot of previous predecessors of Kimmel, who were always concerned that an attack such as the one that was anticipated in 1941 would actually occur on their watch. The threat from the Japanese was something that they had been kind of on the watch for really since 1937. I mean, it was really 37 that basically the tensions between the US and the Japanese really began to emerge, and it was mainly over the Japanese policy in Asia, particularly in China. And, they deepened over those years, and sort of, there was an escalating crisis of relations between the Japanese and the Americans, which is why there were peace talks taking place in Washington where Japanese delegations were invited, and there was back and forth between the Japanese legation in Washington and Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State, and his department. And they were negotiating with the Japanese. It was back and forth, and there was a sort of a sense that the negotiations were that in some ways they were playing for time, and that the decision had already been made. In many respects, the Americans felt that if the Japanese were going to make their move, they were going to make their move, and it was only a matter of time before they would actually attack. It was just a question of when. And there had been all these. One of the problems that actually occurred was Kimmel as Navy commander in Pearl Harbor, and his military counterpart, whose name escapes me for a moment, his name will come to me, General Short. They had constantly given out, on the basis of information that they were supplied by the War Department as well as the Navy Department in Washington. They had constantly been issuing these full alerts essentially putting their forces on standby. So that's Marines, Army, and Navy basically going on full alert, essentially at a moment's notice, just preparing for a potential attack, and they keep doing it. And eventually it just leads to a sort of a complacency. In addition, they're starting to install radar on the island of, I think it's Honolulu, and they're installing it in the sort of the highland areas. But it's new technology, it's being tested, and they've only recently actually appointed 2 radar operators to operate this, and they themselves are getting to grips with it. And the funny thing is that they actually do detect, they are doing their morning shift when they do detect the wave of incoming aircraft off the coast of the island coming in from the north. And so the radar technology, or the RDF technology that they are using, does actually detect the incoming Japanese attack. But because of the complacency that's now been inbuilt within various different mid-level commanders right across Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor and the surrounding military bases all across the island, including Wheeler Field and other satellite areas where they're meant to be providing air cover and air support, where there's fighter defenses in play, ready to basically take off. They don't take this seriously, and it becomes confused with a flight of about 17 incoming B-17 bombers that are flying in from the mainland that morning. And so they mistake this incoming Japanese wave for a friendly formation, which actually ends up arriving in the middle of the attack. So it's very dramatic stuff. A lot of this stuff is actually portrayed in the movie Tora, Tora, Tora, as well as very badly in the later movie that was produced, Pearl Harbor, by Michael Bay and produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, who turned it into the spectacle that it was. But just to say that the one of the things that people realized in recent years, when there were sort of flyovers of aircraft, piston engine aircraft with radial piston engines over the Pearl Harbor base, and this would be in honor, sort of in a tribute to basically the naval aviation of the time, the contemporary aviation that used a pre-turbojet, sort of as a kind of a sort of honoring what happened at Pearl Harbor. One of the things that was concluded was that we just had 3 of these aircraft flying over, and the noise is quite deafening over Ford Island, which is the island in the middle of Pearl Harbor, right in the middle where Battleship Row is, where there is actually a U.S. Navy airbase. There's a U.S. Navy airbase right in the middle of that island, and a runway strip and hangars and all sorts of things. So there's all sorts of stuff on Ford Island, as well as in the mainland naval facility directly across from Ford Island. And you have battleships parked all around, and they're parked closely together for the same reason that the aircraft in all the various different air bases, the 3 main air bases, including the one right next to Pearl Harbor, everything's parked together. And the reason they park everything together is basically to avoid sabotage. They're worried that the Japanese population on the island will actually encroach into these military and naval facilities and actually blow up the aircraft. So they're worried about sabotage, and they're worried about people being landed by the Japanese and basically creeping in. So they're worried about physical sabotage. They're not worried about attacks from the air. And basically the way everything is bunched up on these airfields and in Battleship Row, whatever, the way the ships are all parked together in neat little rows and neat little bunches, makes them an absolutely perfect target from the air, very conspicuously so. And it leads to a lot of conspiracy theorists saying that Pearl Harbor was an inside job and whatever like that, because, how could they be so stupid as to basically bunch everything together, basically presenting it to the Japanese on a plate and increasing the possibility that there would be more casualties, that there would be more material losses and that the outrage would be greater on the part of the American public, and commit them very firmly to a track where they would essentially enter the war and prosecute it until the bitter end, which is what exactly happened. But I don't particularly believe in that. I believe that it was military logic that was prevailing. The aircraft that were parked on the air bases were all split up at one point in order to make them harder to bomb from the air. They did bring them together. I think this is just a particular logic that the American commanders applied, and also in some ways they were poorly advised. One of the things I would also, going back to my comment about the sound of aircraft passing over the airbase at Pearl Harbor, the first attack wave consisted of 183 aircraft led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. And Fuchida was one of the top naval aviators in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was already a war hero in Japan at the time that he led this attack, that he led this wave. And he was leading fighter aircraft as well as low-level bomber aircraft. Essentially, we're talking about two-seater, maximum three-seater bombers, as well as torpedo aircraft that were equipped with torpedoes with wooden fins that allowed them, basically, when they hit the water, that they wouldn't dive too deeply. So they would actually run just literally below the surface of the harbour water and hit their targets. And there was a particular reason for this. It was because the water in the Pearl Harbor in the area was too shallow considered too shallow for a conventional torpedo attack, and so these adapted torpedoes were equipped perfectly for it. And there were also there were two waves, and essentially their job was to basically target the battleships and any aircraft carriers that were there. And conspicuously, there were no American aircraft carriers present at Pearl Harbor, thank goodness, because that would have been a devastating loss, and it would have really blunted the US Navy's ability to fight back in the months that followed. So it was crucial that the US aircraft carriers were deployed. They were deployed on exercises not far from Hawaii. In fact, actually, they were immediately notified when the attack on Pearl Harbor took place, and they were the first responders. The problem was that they deployed their aircraft they vectored them in the wrong direction. So they missed the Japanese fleet, but they did have an opportunity to attack the Japanese fleet, which consisted of 6 aircraft carriers as well as escorts. And the first targets were the battleships and aircraft carriers, and then the second group, their targets were meant to be Ford Island and Wheeler Field, which is Ford Island was a naval airbase, and Wheeler Field was the main army airbase right adjacent to Pearl Harbor. And they essentially they also attacked Hickam Field and Barbers Point and Kanawha, and they had aircraft coming down, strafing, doing basically dive bombing, and sort of every type of, shall we say, bombing technique that could be used, including torpedo bombing, glide bombing, and dive bombing. It was all deployed within this attack. And one of the things I just wanted to say is, if you look at Pearl Harbor in the round, if you look at it in terms of its attack, bearing in mind that it is not it's not the only assault that is taking place. The Japanese are launching assaults all over the place. They're landing in Malaya on the west coast of Malaya. They're coming ashore there, and they are going to basically overrun Malaya, and they're going to be at the gates of Singapore within less than 3 months. We're talking about maybe less than 2.5 months before they are actually going to be taking the surrender of the British commander in Singapore, Percival. And they're going with about a month or so after that, they will have received the surrender of MacArthur's deputy commander on the Philippines as well. So they are completely going to overrun the whole of the Far East and the Western Pacific area, and they're going to go down into the South Pacific. They're going to have carrier groups deployed into the Indian Ocean. They're going to be making attacks on Ceylon, what's now known as Sri Lanka. They're going to be attacking Colombo. They're going to be launching attacks all over the place, and they're going to be attacking an Australian Navy base at Darwin. So that's going to be the Australian Pearl Harbor as well. And they're going to do this within very quick succession over a matter of weeks and months, and they're going to have military assaults, and they're going to overrun the entire place. And the point I'm going to make to you, Eddie, is all of this combined with what they do at Pearl Harbor is something that has never, I'm sorry to use a very Trumpian expression, but it is something that has never been seen before, either in the annals of military warfare or in the annals of naval warfare. Never before, over such a vast swathe, but a quarter of the planet we're talking about, over a vast swathe of ocean, over sizable land masses, including part of a continent. I'm referring to Indochina, and in all the waterways and channels and seas and oceans that lay between the Indian Ocean and the mid-Pacific area. All of that. Never before had anything like this been achieved in any part of the planet by sea and by air and by land. And the Japanese managed to do it not even in a 6-month period, but within a 3-month period. It was absolutely unprecedented, the scale of what they managed to pull off in late 41, early 42. It was and it was a massive shock to the system, both for Western Allied powers, both the British Empire and its associated Commonwealth countries, including Australia and Canada, as well as the United States itself. It was a huge shock. It was a very, very much a dent to their morale. It was a psychological blow. It was considered to be the fall of Singapore is considered to be the moment that marks the end of the British Empire. Not even though that comes 40 years later. This is considered to be the moment that the empire really stopped being the important institution that it used to be. That it was undermined. That it was discovered to be floundering, and that really it's the point at which the formal end of the empire is marked, the 15th of February 1942. And one has to say that at that particular moment in world history, the only power that was capable of pulling that off was Imperial Japan.
Interesting. We got a comment here in strictly Second World War terms. This is from JMCN2910. In the strictly Second World War terms, I think two equally important events that led to the defeat of the Germans are the success of Operation Dynamo and the German defeat of Stalingrad. Now, we can talk about that. I think we're talking about a day and with this long-term strategic implications, but I'm not saying you're wrong or we're right. And then we got another comment here. Kim Il-sung's family spent years trying to rehabilitate him, which is true. And that is another topic. So let's move on to the next date. Now we're moving on to 1942. This is the Carson raid, and the guy on the right is Evans Carlson, and he put a small group together of Marines, mixed formation, including Marines and some Australians, I believe, and they raided up the coast of Guadalcanal in the period starting. Well, it ended in this month, or did it start this month? Anyway, so the quite famous, and one of the reasons it's kind of famous because I think the fictional character Michael Corleone, who was in The Godfather, if you remember the film, right at the beginning, you got the wedding of his sister, and he turns up in uniform, and it's referred to in the first part of the film. They say, "We love it that you were a hero, Mikey." I think he was in the book depicted as being a member of the Carson Raiders. Am I wrong on that one?
Yes, that was my understanding. Anyway, I need to do more research on his character, because a lot of these sagas, like particularly the Godfather saga and the story of the Corleones, there's a backdrop story to these stories, and the backdrop story to Michael Corleone. He's a war hero. He comes back to his family a war hero at the end of the war, and he's wearing the uniform of a captain in the United States Marines, and he's bedecked with medals. And his backstory is apparently that he's involved in essentially special forces in the Pacific, and he's involved in special operations. And that can only mean you had para Marines, so you had, and there is a fictional movie involving Robert Taylor, which was made about Marines that were trained as paratroopers that flew from Australia, involved in basically airborne operations over an island. But the truth about it is there were trained para Marines, but there was never a parachute drop involving trained para Marines. They were only ever deployed amphibiously, and if they were flown anywhere, they would have been air landed, and they never would have been dropped. So there was never an airborne drop involving para Marines. So Michael Corleone is definitely not one of them. He is most certainly would have to have been a member of either of the two battalions that were trained by Evans Carlson. And in fact, actually, to this day, within the United States Marine Corps, they actually have their own Special Forces wing that was recently reestablished. So basically a Marine equivalent of the Navy SEALs, which actually works very closely with the Navy SEALs. They send personnel to work with Navy SEALs all the time, and they're known as the Raiders. So this particular branch of the U.S. Marines is set up in order to, they're trying to emulate the kind of tactics that are going to be used by British commanders like Ord Wingate, who, he's the creator of the Chindits, and he's pioneered this warfare he's pioneered it in Palestine. And also they're looking at the commando units that have been formed in Europe as well. And they're just thinking to themselves, we have Marines. Marines are trained, broadly speaking, to a much better standard and quality than our army counterparts, even though our equipment is very much outdated and sometimes lagging behind. Well, not the case with Evans Carlson's Raiders. Evans Carlson's Raiders were equipped with the latest in terms of US military kit. So while a lot of their Marine colleagues deployed on Guadalcanal were armed with Springfield bolt-action rifles and Hotchkiss submachine guns and completely out-of-date kit, the funniest line in the series The Pacific is when one of the characters, one of the true life characters, basically when they're raiding an army supply depot that has just basically been landed on Guadalcanal because the army are moving in, they're looking for all this gear, they're looking for food and different things like that, and they start basically raiding all these boxes, and they crack open a box and they discovered M1 Garand rifles, state-of-the-art weapons, automatic weapons that basically the army are equipped with. And this particular character says, army gets the new stuff and we fight with shit my grandfather used. Basically, this was sort of the kind of lot of the Marines. They always were behind the army in terms of getting the state-of-the-art in terms of standard issue weaponry. Well, Carlson's men were the first to be equipped with the latest, the state-of-the-art. They received, we're talking about the Browning automatic rifle. They received the latest variant of the Thompson submachine gun with the box magazine instead of the round drum magazine that their Marine counterparts were using on the island. They were using the M1 Garand and also the M1 carbine, and they were equipped with all the gear. They would have been using the air-cooled the 30 caliber machine gun, which was lighter to carry. So they basically had all the latest gear. They were trained in terms of basically how to use explosives, and they were trained also to fight in small numbers, conducting small unit actions, ambushes, and so forth, and performing sabotage operations. And the first operation that the Raiders are deployed in is the attack on Macon Atoll. And this is predating the invasion of Macon and the nearby Tara Atoll that we were talking about last week. Well, the attack on Macon was the first commando raid to be basically launched by United States Armed Forces during the Second World War. And it was the first land attack that the US carried out anywhere. And it was a raid that lasted about 24 to 36 hours. They landed these raiders by submarine. They're wearing camouflaged uniforms. They have helmets, and they go ashore, and they basically end up attacking an inferior force, causing a lot of damage, grabbing intelligence, and essentially going off the island. Well, this attack was basically it was considered to be basically a nuisance raid, but also a potential it potentially had the effect of diverting Japanese attention away from the South Pacific towards the Central Pacific, and maybe causing a redeployment of military resources and naval resources to a different area of the Pacific. Well, anyway, Carlson, the second operation that the raiders are involved in, the raiders are involved in the defense of the field of Guadalcanal. So basically they're involved in fighting at Bloody Ridge and basically defending the perimeter. And at a later point, and this is the other battalion of the raiders that don't see action in the Central Pacific, at Macon, they're involved in a long-range patrol, or essentially raid, deep behind enemy lines beyond the perimeter of the manned perimeter of Guadalcanal. The army are moving in, and basically they are pushing and progressing inland towards other areas, and they're basically bringing the fight to the Japanese, and they're driving them into the interior. Meanwhile, the Marines are pushing away at their side of the perimeter, and they're basically trying to attack in the Japanese rear. So Carlson's patrol, what they're trying to do is they're essentially trying to root out the Japanese, harry them, destroy Japanese installations, including gun positions, and little camps that they've built all along the Lunga and the Temeru River, essentially just following along these riverways and just attacking them wherever they can find them. And they really harry the Japanese. They gather a huge amount of intelligence on them. And their objective, you can't really see it on the map, but basically they go from the Henderson Field perimeter as far as a location called Kokumbuna, which is, you can just literally just about make it out. Just if you look at the Guadalcanal Islands, if you look just above the G at the beginning of Guadalcanal, you can see a name beginning with K, and that's Kokumbuna. And Kokumbuna is a location where the Japanese have a cluster of little kind of, it's a sort of a base, it's a temporary base, like an encampment that's made from basically bamboo and other stuff that they can pull together. And they have a few positions there basically that the Marine raiders end up attacking, and then basically they end up knocking them out. And really by the end of the Carlson's patrol, by the end of this particular period, it's becoming evident that the Japanese don't really have much fight in them, that the surviving Japanese garrison on the island don't have the ability, they do not have the ability to break the will of the Marines and the army personnel based within the Henderson Field perimeter. And the Americans have the upper hand. They're on the offensive, and it's only going to be a matter of time, possibly a matter of months, before the land war on Guadalcanal is comprehensively won by the army. The army finish off the job, and the Marines are going to be withdrawn. So they've effectively, at this point, they've won the Battle of Guadalcanal, and they dominate the air. So they're starting to have air superiority, and the Japanese Navy stop running their supply runs down the slot to drop off, reinforcements and also supplies. So basically, at this point, the Battle of Guadalcanal is won.
Okay, let's move on to another year, and this is this week. That's the first week of December 1943. The Tehran Conference closes. I'm not going to go over that again. That was an enormously consequential meeting. Stalin, Roosevelt, and a rather miserable-looking Churchill. And then also in December 1943, this very extraordinary event. There was a secret cargo of mastered gas bombs on an American Liberty ship in Bari in Italy. It was hit by German, that and other ships were hit by German bombers, released a mustard gas cloud, and dozens of people were killed, and many people suffered afterwards from the effects of the mustard gas. Of course, they weren't supposed to have it. It wasn't supposed to be there, but it was, and it was suppressed. And so really the records were only declassified in 1959, and it only became better known in 1967, but it's memorialized now a bit in Bari, as I remembered, because consequences were terrible for the town. One of the strange byproducts of this was that Harold Alexander intervened, and he got some samples, I think, from people who died, and this material was subsequently used in, it is said, for developing anti-cancer treatments in the post-war period. Anyway, so it's an all-win that does nobody any good. Moving on to also, this is 1943. So after Roosevelt and Churchill had been in Tehran seeing Stalin, they went back to Cairo, where they'd been before, on the way to Tehran, where they'd seen Chiang Kai-shek. And when they got to Cairo in the second Cairo conference in December 1943, they met this guy. He's known as President Inonu, but his real name is Mustafa İsmet. He's a Turk who was born actually in Izmir and Smyrna, which is now Smyrna, which was Izmir at the time. It's now Izmir, but it was called Smyrna. It was a largely Greek populated city when he was born there, very cosmopolitan. And he was a liberal. He joined the Committee of Union and Progress, which was a left-wing liberal movement that emerged in the Ottoman Empire before the First World War. And he emerged as a very significant military figure in the Ottoman army, and he was actually in the command of 20 Corps in the Palestine front. So he was helping to fend off the British army, including the 16th Irish Brigade, who were trying to capture Jerusalem and then move on to Syria and then the war. So he, in the First World War, he was on the other side. He was with the Ottomans and the Germans. And then he emerged again in the 1920s as a very significant figure in the national movement in Turkey, nationalistic movement. And he succeeded Kemal Atatürk in 1938 to become president of the Turkish Republic. Now, most people have heard of Kemal Atatürk. Practically nobody's heard of Inonu. But in many respects, he's a figure that should be treated with some, almost equivalent respect. He was very important in helping to modernize the Ottomans and Turkish Republic. He was a liberal. He wanted a republic, and he was very much influenced by liberal and socialist ideas. He introduced multi-party democracy to Turkey before the Second World War, and he continued to advocate it. And he was a significant figure in Turkey. And here, the Republican Party of Turkey is the oldest party in Turkey. It still exists, and it's a member of the Socialist International, believe it or not. So not much more. But the key thing about this moment, Joe, the meeting between Inonu, Roosevelt, and Churchill in Cairo, is that the Allied strategy, they weren't quite sure what to do with Turkey. Inevitably, Churchill was mad keen and trying to persuade the Turks to join the Allied side because he was obsessed with the Balkans and his Mediterranean strategy, and he wanted to get the Turks on side. The Turks and the Americans were much more cautious about it. The Turks themselves, up until June 1941, really wanted to make sure they stayed on good terms with the Soviets. That was their strategy, right from the very... Kemal Atatürk was supported by the Soviets. Lenin supported him. And so they wanted Turkey as a kind of buffer state, a secular republic, and they didn't want to alienate. So the Turkish government didn't want to alienate Russia. But once Russia was attacked, or Soviet Union was attacked in 1941, and it looked like the Germans were going to win, there was a certain amount of pressure within Turkey for them to ally themselves, as they did in the First World War, with the Germans. But by 1943, that had all gone. Starting the grad had finished. It's obvious that Germany's going to lose. And what was going on here, they were considering, Churchill and Roosevelt considering trying to persuade Turkey to come in as an ally in the war. Inonu resisted that pressure, saying we want to stay neutral. But it did declare war. Turkey did declare war at the end of the war, I think in the spring of 1945, and consequently became a founding member of the United Nations. And Turkey became one of the first members of NATO, of which it is still a very proud, significant member. So Inonu is a figure that I think should be remembered. Anything to say about Turkey in the Second World War, Joe? Any insights?
Not a huge amount, apart from the fact that there's always speculation about which side Turkey would choose in the event of war. The Turks were very clear. Any Allied enticements to join the war on the Allied side probably would have fallen on deaf ears as far as the Turks are concerned. They were definitely intimidated by the presence of the Italians and the Germans within Greek territory. Were probably quite keen to avoid getting drawn in. It was really happening not in their backyard, but in their front yard, so to speak. And they would have been anxious to maintain good relations. I'm sure also the Axis powers also wanted them to join. But I think, like a number of countries, I think probably the memory of how badly things had gone for them in the First World War was something that might have acted as a very powerful deterrent. Not to mention that any British overtures towards the Turks to get involved in the war probably would have been met with a large degree of skepticism, bearing in mind that the British and Commonwealth and Imperial forces, among other Allied forces, were involved in believe it or not, a post-war occupation of areas of Turkey. They occupied Istanbul. There were British soldiers that occupied what had previously been the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And also, the Greeks attacked. They attacked basically Western Anatolia and advanced. They were at the gates of Ankara, and they were encouraged to do so by Lloyd George, who was Churchill's old associate. And bear in mind that Churchill was colonial secretary at this particular time. So, the Turks narrowly, under Kemal Ataturk's leadership, the Turks narrowly avoided a situation where the Greeks possibly ended up taking their capital and annexing half of their state, half of their nascent republic, which was being born from the ashes of this disastrous war, which cost them their empire virtually in its entirety. This transition from being a great imperial power to being a nation state, a republic, which is bankrupt, ruined by the cost of war, and also having lost a great deal of manpower on foreign battlefields. It's a catastrophe for Turkey, and there's, followed by the invasion, the Greek invasion, and also the uprising of Greek, sort of populations. Bear in mind that Turkey was a multi-ethnic state, and there was a very large ethnic Greek population, which had been present in that land since the time of Herodotus. These Greeks had risen up, and in places like Smyrna, which is now known as Izmir, and different other parts, they had risen up in the hope of basically having a united Greek homeland, which included what was seen to be Greek territory in Anatolia. Well, that didn't work out, and the Turks narrowly managed to drive the Greek army out, and there was a treaty that was reached between the Greek government and the Turkish government, whereby there was an exchange of populations. Turkish populations and what is now Greek territories or Greek islands were basically exchanged over to Turkey, and then the Greek populations that were living on Turkish soil, they were relocated to other parts of Greece. And it was a very sad incident where you saw a lot of culturally Greek areas of what is now today modern Turkey, including Gallipoli, including the location of the Gallipoli landings. That was not a Turkish peninsula; that was a Greek peninsula, and there were Greek populations living there when that battle took place. So we're talking about a country that goes through quite a lot of transformations in the 1920s after the First World War, and they've had their fingers burned. There's no way that they're going to get involved in the Second World War if they've got any sense. And they also have this, all these reforms have been introduced by Ataturk. He's westernized the country. He's very much keenly aware of everything that's going on. He doesn't want to isolate Turkey. He wants it to be connected with surrounding powers like the Soviet Union. As I said, they're a big player in terms of Turkey is almost like a client state of the Soviet Union. So there's no way that the Western Allies can, or Nazi Germany for that matter, can successfully interfere with Turkey. They have to be very careful. The last thing I would say is that Turkey had its uses as a neutral state. It was a place where in 1944, what's known as the Vermeeren incident takes place, and this is where a German agent, either working for or connected with the Abwehr, essentially defects wholesale over to the British. It essentially walks into the British embassy in Ankara and effectively gives away everything that he knows. He blows the Abwehr's remaining networks across all these neutral territories and all across Europe, and essentially it's effectively the death knell for German intelligence, and effectively the British are able to successfully infiltrate and spike basically all these networks in various different remaining locations. So, the German intelligence apparatus is essentially defenestrated because of the Wehrmachen incident, and it's the death knell of the German intelligence apparatus in Europe and globally. From then on, essentially German intelligence ceases to be a very effective, shall we say, component of Germany's war during the Second World War.
Okay, well, let's two other slides we can discuss. I want to put this up. Operation Crossbow. And that's the film that was made in 1965. Very enjoyable, actually. It's got Sophia Loren in it, Jeremy Brett, and also the young, I've got his name now, the actor, British actor. He's in it. It's really watchable and rather dark story. Operation Crossbow was an attempt by the United Kingdom bombers to knock out the missile sites. At one point, they were aiming to use around 40% of the RAF to bomb it. It was highly unsuccessful, so the film is not accurate. I don't want to go into that, Joe. Let's move on to the last slide, which is the December events, which probably don't mean much to most people, but they do in Greece. And this was the start of the basically to set the scene for the Civil War. But the Germans had withdrawn. They pulled out of Greece, didn't really want to be there in the first place. And so they had a vacuum. The king was brought back, but there was the popular left-wing forces, mainly communist. And this was the demonstrations in December. The British and Greek police fired on them. There were deaths. And they have something called the December events, which went on from 3rd December 1944, when the shootings took place, all the way to January 1945, at the end of which Athens was stabilized and paratroopers had to be deployed. I think the picture there is actually, I think you've got some British paras operating in Athens, and someone who's dressed up looks like he's a German to put down the communist movement. And things were so bad, Churchill, didn't he? He came over to Athens to try and sort things out, because it was a bit of a political mess, wasn't it, Joe?
Yes, I mean, you effectively, Greece is considered to be an ally. It's considered to be an allied power. And it is a real mess, because you have a civil war breaking out almost at the moment that the country is liberated. And, you've got a lot of Italians that essentially tens of thousands of Italian ex-soldiers, who, they're still soldiers, but they were ex-Italian army soldiers, Italians that essentially went over wholesale to the Greeks. And they also split both ways. You had a lot of Italians that basically said, no, actually, we weren't really communists. Sorry, we weren't really fascists or followers of Mussolini. We actually happened to be communists all along, and socialists and whatnot. And they all join forces. They're not only are they involved in the Greek resistance against German and Italian, the German occupation. They're involved in the Civil War, and they all take sides. And you've got like Italian, sort of ex-Italian army, soldiers who become heroes of both the Greek resistance and then also the Civil War, and they become really well-known figures within, the battles between Elias and can't remember essentially the two very similar sounding and acronyms for basically both sides.
Yes.
Yes, and
the thing is that Greece becomes a seminal moment in post-war Europe.
Yeah,
because Britain had reached the agreement with Stalin, I think first set up in Tehran, is that Greece was going to be mainly British influence. Yes. And you have to remember that Greece was created largely as a result of British influence. The Kingdom of Greece was created as a manifestation of British policy in the Mediterranean. Yeah. And St. Churchill himself was very attached to Greece as a kingdom of Greece. And Britain had a responsibility of stabilising the country after the war. My uncle, who was in British intelligence, naval intelligence, he went up in the mountains, got shot at by, in 1945, got shot at by Greek communists, and he was doing intelligence work. And the issue was that in the end, that Britain couldn't cope with the cost and the burden of stabilising Greece post-war, and said, we're going to pull out of this. And that's when the Marshall Plan, of course, was proclaimed by George C. Marshall, Secretary of State at that point. Previously, at this point in 1944, he was the Supreme Commander, American Commander in Washington. So Greece, again, it's one of those subjects. You look at the consequences of the Second World War. We looked prominently at Pearl Harbor, and we got these events in Greece. This was a terrible shock. It was really embarrassing for the British because we were supposed to be liberating the Greeks, not shooting them. And then it led to a diversion of forces. At least one division was pulled out of Italy and sent to Greece to stabilise the situation, make sure the king was kept in place, which obviously the left didn't want. And this led to already profound implications. So yet again, it's another one of those issues. Now we're going to close now, Joe. I mean, I'm not going to deal with any dates in 45, although I think we discussed some of the war crime stuff we've got. MacArthur arresting the Japanese prime minister, who was the Japanese prime minister for part of the Second World War. He was replaced by Tojo.
That's right.
Or he replaced Tojo. I can't remember anyway.
No, Tojo replaced him. Yeah, Konoe was PM. He was prime minister right up until, and then Tojo took over, and then Konoe actually, he was like, I mean, just to be very brief about this, Konoe, his fall was really triggered by the fact that he sort of he was responsible for defending the emperor against charges that the emperor was responsible for starting the war. So he defended the emperor and got him off the hook. But he was also very brazen in terms of saying that, you know, Japan had no choice but to embark upon this war. And this brought him into very hot water with the American authorities. So essentially, he painted a target on his own back, whereas other Japanese were more careful about essentially, you know, sort of getting themselves off the hook.
And he wasn't military, was he? No, he was.
No, he wasn't. He was a civilian. He was a civilian prime minister. He had connections with the Navy, though. He did have some background with the Navy, but he was an anti-militarist, and he would have been one of these people that was trying to hold the tide out against the militarists taking over the government. Which and
Yamashita, as we say, was convicted. This week in 1945, and he was, he was the commander, Japanese forces that captured Malaya. So we go back to 1941. He led a very successful campaign. He was convicted and executed. We discussed that before. And then we've got these terrible ramifications from 1945, when the United States actually said we're going to accept that 6 million Germans living in, what was the Soviet Union, Silesia and Poland, Sudetenland and elsewhere, are going to be kicked out of their countries and effectively deported to Germany, mainly to West Germany. Very profound long-term implications. Joe, I'm not going to, unless you've got a final closing point. Joe?
No, just I think it was a very good point that you made. Is there a more significant date? But this episode has been largely about, Pearl Harbor and a lot of things that stem from it. Was there a more important date in modern history? I think that the line from Admiral Yamamoto on learning that the Americans had not been properly informed that war was going to be declared, or that an attack was coming their way. So indeed, it was a surprise attack, and basically the Japanese declaration of war and essentially the breakdown of diplomatic relations had not been properly communicated, and Yamamoto immediately understood the significance of that in terms of what that was likely to do to the American psyche. And his line, I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled them with a terrible resolve. I think the terrible resolve is something that terrible resolve of the United States, this great American power, this American colossus, is something that we are still living in the shadow of to this day.
Absolutely, Joe. Absolutely perfect way to end this show. Thank you, Joe. Marvelous. Again, tour de force, going through these dates. These stories are so extraordinary. The significance we've talked about, not just Japan, the United States, is an amazing moment. but also Italy, Greece, Turkey, countries that, Greece and Turkey don't get much attention, but it's so important, in Thailand as well. Anyway, look, Joe, thanks very much. I'm now going to close the show, so I'll see you in a minute. And that's it. So that was the 14th episode of This Week in the Second World War. I hope you found it interesting. The period, the Second World War, is a time of such significance and so open to further interpretation. It's a pivotal moment in human experience and history. So there's every reason for people to be interested in it and to revisit what we thought was settled history. And that's happening all the time. And I hope we contribute a little bit to your understanding of this critical moment in human history. So anyway, that's it for this week. We'll be back next week around the same time. So until then, from everybody here at This Week in the Second World War, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.